I want to tell you all, or begin today, with the story of Dick Rowland. You can see a picture of Dick here. He is on the kind of the middle, my left, your right. I'm getting mixed up. Directions are hard for me. This is a picture of him. I have a little arrow there for you. And the story of Dick Rowland comes to us from the year 1921. And this is the year we enter into our story, 1921, and racial tension was high in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now, this would be the height of the Jim Crow era in the South, and racial divides were at an all-time high. And it is into this moment of racial tensility our story today takes place. On May 30th, a 19-year-old black man named Dick Rowland entered an elevator in a building called the Drexel Building in Tulsa. Now, Dick was a shoe shiner, and the Drexel Building had the only blacks-only restroom in the area where he worked. And so he chose to go in there to use the restroom. The restroom was on the top floor, so of course he went to the elevator. Now, the elevator was operated by a young white woman named Sarah Page. Now, here's what we know. We don't know all the facts, but we know some. Something happened in the elevator. What exactly happened is unclear to the lens of history, but something happened. Now, some reports suggest that Dick Rowland may have accidentally bumped into Paige. He may have stepped on her foot, may have jostled her a little bit, causing her to scream in terror. Some testimonials say that they heard a scream from the elevator. Others say they may have been friends. They may have known each other beforehand. Regardless of what happened, after the incident, Rowland was arrested, Dick Rowland, he was arrested and taken to jail. But interestingly enough, Sarah never accused him of assault or even pursued any charges against him. The police investigated the evidence. They interviewed Sarah, had a conversation with her, but since she never accused Dick of anything and did not press any charges, they eventually dropped the case. But the next day, this is May 31, a white-owned newspaper, the Tulsa Tribune, published an inflammatory article suggesting Rowland had attacked Paige in the elevator. This headline sparked communal outrage, and white mobs gathered at the courthouse demanding Rowland be handed over. Black residents, knowing the history of lynchings in the South, went to protect him. They tried to defend him, but they were outnumbered. Things escalated, and soon the mob took over. And things became violent. The mob began to grow out of control. They burned homes, destroyed businesses. They even dropped firebombs from planes. The true extent of the fallout is not known, but what we do know is anywhere between 1 and 300 people were killed, around 800 injured, more than 1,200 homes destroyed, 35 blocks of the city decimated, and over 10,000 people left homeless. I have some pictures of Tulsa after the events took place here. So severe was the destruction that many victims' bodies were never found or identified, leaving the death toll uncertain. Now, this was the story I found myself digging into this month, trying to understand, just reading the history, trying to learn, not trying to take any sort of angle or agenda, but just really understand what actually took place at this event here. And one thing is certain that I've come to, it is that I do not know what took place in that elevator. In fact, none of us know what took place in that elevator. And perhaps this young woman was harmed by Dick Rowland. And if so, I believe this should be taken seriously. It is a shame that it needs to be said, but as a man, I feel like I need to say this and speak this loudly. One needs only to gaze upon the roads of history to see the list of women who claim to be victims and were ignored by men is very long. At times it seems the cries of the victim goes unheard, especially by those who are in positions of power and authority and influence. And the church is not immune to this. The list of women harmed in the church throughout the history is long. The list of women who cried out and said, "This happened to me," and the church did not have ears to hear, is long. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done still. And there has been lots of work that has been done, lots of men that have come forward, taken accountability. But much needs to happen still. And something I've learned as I've aged, as I've gotten older, is that two things can be true at once. Something you learn, I think, as the years go on, is not everything is a false dichotomy. You can hold two things in tension. So it can be true on the one hand that many, many, many times women are not taken seriously when they come forward and say, this happened to me. And in this story, it seems, at least from my lens, and perhaps we can have a conversation about this, I want to have an open mind. It seems that the race of Dick Rowland seemed to play a major role in the way things happened here in this story. I say this because it's intriguing to me that in this story, it was not the woman, not the alleged victim who came forward and said, this happened to me. In fact, she did not claim to be victimized. Instead, it was the mob who, without even a conversation, without even a trial, without due process, decided this young man was guilty and deserved death. And it has me thinking to myself, is it not interesting the lengths this community was willing to go for revenge over what appears to be a misunderstanding? I'd like to invite us into our text for today, Matthew chapter 5, verse 21. It says, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who's angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. And whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the fire of Gehenna. Last week, if you were here with us, you joined us for another week in our series called The Jesus Way, where we're talking about, man, what does it look like to follow after the Jesus way in a world of so many ways, so many different paths, so many different worldviews, perspectives? What does it look like to be people of the way? And so that's what we're delving into. We are continuing on that journey today. Last week I talked about how Jesus said he came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, to fill it to the top, so to speak. And if you were here, you saw me use a little illustration with a little glass of water. And you know what occurred to me after? Multiple people said this to me after. You sipped from that cup of water and it came from the bucket. And I did not realize that in the moment, because sometimes when I'm preaching, the adrenaline is going. And what I didn't realize was that was one of the foot washing buckets. And I had put water in it from the tap. And I know, I'm so grateful for our deacons. Harley, he washes those buckets every time. So I know they're sterilized, but still, it left a little taste in my mouth. So that was an interesting reflection to me after. But last week we talked about Jesus saying he came to fill the law to the top. As he moves into his Sermon on the Mount, his magnum opus, his manifesto, so to speak. This is what it looks like to follow my way. And so now this week, he begins to move into exactly what his way is. And so for the next several weeks, I want to hit home on the same big idea that I see Jesus inviting us into time and time again with each of these little things, these little paragraphs that he's going to invite us into. And here's what it is. I summed it up for you in a single sentence. The thing I think he's getting at. The heart of God beneath the law calls us higher than the law ever could. So there is a heart that God has for us, for people. And his heart is beneath the rules that he gave to the children of Israel. And what Jesus is doing is he's pointing back to that original heart. And he's saying, this is God's heart for you. And it calls us to a much higher standard than the law ever could. So, let's rock and roll for just a few minutes. I want to read verse 22. It says this, everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. We already read it, but just to reiterate, whoever insults his brother will be liable to the Sanhedrin or the council, and whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the fire of Gehenna. Now, a few words here on this, just so we understand what's going on culturally, contextually. When he says judgment, he's saying, whoever's angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. What does he mean by that? Well, there were these local courts in Jewish culture at the time. And if you committed a crime locally, you would go to the local court, the local magistrate, and they would review your case. And this is essentially what he means. And then when he says the council, he's talking about the Sanhedrin. I think it says Sanhedrin here. So some of you know the Sanhedrin. This was the Jewish religious council at the time in Jerusalem. in the first century. So this was where all of the priests would gather together, the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the high priest. They would gather together. This is the council Jesus is brought before his death. They bring him to the secret night council before the Sanhedrin, a secret clandestine meeting. So this is the Sanhedrin. And if you committed a really, really bad crime or a religious crime, then you would be pulled towards the Sanhedrin, and they would issue judgment over you. But then he takes an interesting turn. He says, whoever calls someone a fool is liable to Gehenna. What does he mean? Some translations, maybe you've read in a different version, it says, he will be liable to the fires of hell. Now, what they're doing there is they're doing an interpretation of the actual Greek word that Jesus uses, which is Gehenna. And now just a little context around Gehenna. Gehenna was a valley southeast of Jerusalem. And it's an interesting area. It has a lot of interesting lore. So if you want to look up Gehenna lore, it's pretty interesting. Just Google it, ChatGPT. It has some interesting things in there. But Gehenna was a valley southeast of Jerusalem, and essentially what it was known for was hundreds of years prior, when Canaanite tribes lived in the area, this was a valley where they would worship Molech. And we've talked about Molech before, but as a refresher, Molech was a pagan god where he had the body of a man and the head of a bull. And basically what they would do to worship Molech is they would build these bronze statues of Molech with his hands outstretched in open palm, and then they would sacrifice their children, their babies, by putting them in the open palm, and a fire would be burning beneath the hands until the hands were red hot. And this is essentially types of cultures and practices that lived in the area at the time. And so in this valley, this is the type of worship that would take place. And so when the Jews took over this area, when they came into Jerusalem, they so detested this place, and they had such a righteous indignation and anger for the atrocities that took place in this valley, that they tore everything down, got rid of everything. But so disgusted were they by that area, was that became an area where they would throw all of their trash and even dead bodies, dead animals. If there were criminals, they would, instead of burying them, their custom was to burn instead. And so this area became known as kind of a gross, disgusting, dark valley that was always lit by the smoldering smoke of fire, because they had to burn these bodies to prevent the smoke and disease from spreading in a time before disinfectant, right? So what's important about all this, that's just a little context so we understand what we're talking about. What is important about all this is that this is one of the metaphors, this word Gehenna, this is a metaphor Jesus uses to describe the final judgment. It's one of a few different metaphors that he uses when he's talking about the time at the end when, if you've aligned yourself with evil, God, out of his love, he gives you over to the evil and says, I will not force you because I love you, and so you can remain with evil. But he has to eradicate evil. And so because of that, in his brokenheartedness, God eradicates evil with fire. And so Jesus describes this time at the end with this word, Gehenna. So what is he getting at? All of this to say, it's a lot of words, but let's zero in. Jesus seems to be suggesting that anger and calling someone specifically a fool is a salvation issue. Very interesting. He's linking anger itself to final destiny, which is, it's heavy to say the least. We often don't think of anger connected to being a salvific issue. And so our question today is that the case? Is that what Jesus is talking about? Is he saying anytime you're angry, you're in risk of losing your salvation? Anytime you're angry, anytime, if you just offhandedly, you call someone a fool, which in our time and place, calling someone a fool is like one of the lowest forms, it's like one of the tamest words that you could use to call someone, right? On the list, the hierarchy of mean-spirited words, it's pretty low, right? It's in like the bottom tier. It's like C tier. The S tier words, I'm not going to say them in church, right? Some of them I've never said in my life, because some of them are so intense, right? So is that what he's saying? Well, let's dig a little deeper here. So this word insult, when he says, if anyone is angry against you, or whoever is angry with his brother will be liable. Whoever insults his brother. This word insult, it's the word raka. Everyone say raka. Now, raka is an interesting word. It is an Aramaic word, and essentially it is a word of bitter contempt that they would use. If you're just dismissing someone, or you think someone's stupid, something like that, you would say, raka, something like that. It literally means empty head, worthless person, or a fool. You're essentially saying that person has nothing of value in their mind, nothing to offer me. I'm writing you off as utterly worthless. And so we have a second word here in the same sentence that Jesus says. He says, not only does anyone who insult his brother, but whoever says, you fool. Now this word fool, what are we talking about? This word fool is not Aramaic, it's actually Greek. And it's the word more. Everyone say more. Now more might be familiar because more is where we get the word moron from. It's a familiar word. I know that's a word I used when I was a kid. I was probably angry with my brother, and I'm like, you moron. Such a silly word. But this word has some serious origins because it means essentially the same thing in Greek. It means you are mentally dull or stupid. Essentially, same idea. There's nothing of value in your brain. My mom's calling me. If she calls me again, I'll know she's having an emergency. We'll be okay. We have a 2 phone call rule in our family. So, oh man, that threw me off. And my mom usually watches these, so that makes me interested. We'll see what happens. I may put this on hold to call my mom back. So, here's what we know Jesus can't be talking about. We know it can't be that Jesus is saying anger itself is a sin. Why? Well, first of all, because Jesus himself gets angry, right? We know that Jesus gets angry in the story, right? The classic scene where he's flipping the tables in the temple because they're exploiting people. So we know Jesus gets angry. So anger itself cannot be a sin because the scripture tells us that Jesus was tempted in every way yet without sin. So we know that Jesus did not sin while being angry, okay? We also know that calling someone a fool itself is not a salvation issue because Jesus himself uses this word fool, this exact same word, more, when he's describing the Pharisees. And not even once, but multiple times. So Jesus is dishing out fool here, fool there. You fools, you den of vipers, you hypocrites, you fools. He says the exact same word. So we know that Jesus can't, it's typical Jesus silly stuff, where he's saying one thing, but really there's something a little bit deeper beneath. So what is a deeper beneath? And what I would like to submit to you is the deeper idea beneath is contempt. Why do I say contempt? Well, according to Jesus, if you make up your mind someone has nothing of value to share, if you just write someone totally off, right, this word raka, that they have an empty brain, that they have nothing of value in their mind, that you just say someone is completely worthless, you devalue them to the point where in your heart you feel contempt for them, that's the danger. So it's not anger on the surface. Anger is very human. Jesus has anger. God himself has anger against sin. He has anger when people are taken advantage of, right? So God himself gets angry. Jesus gets angry. So it's not anger that is wrong. Anger is not a sinful emotion to experience. But it's when that anger transforms into something else and when it transforms into contempt. And so he says, if you get to the place where you are able to say, this person is worthless to me, they are, to use a phrase that we would say today, dead to me. Jesus says, you are in salvation danger zone. Why? Why is that? I think we learned something from the Lord's Prayer, right? You all remember that part of the Lord's Prayer? Forgive us our debts as we forgive those who have, right, against us. And then there's that part at the end that says, for if you do not forgive those who have sinned against you, how can your Father in heaven forgive you? There's something that Jesus seems to link being forgiven and being a forgiver, that if you cannot forgive people, there is some questions about whether or not you have received forgiveness yourself. It's not that God is withholding it. It's just a question about, have you really received forgiveness if you then in turn cannot forgive? And so, I believe Jesus is calling us into 3 things here. Number 1 is the idea that Jesus way people, that's us, right? We're here, we're in church. We are claiming to be people of the Jesus way. And so, this is what I think Jesus is saying. Jesus way people push back against contempt. And especially in a world that is kind of enjoys contempt. And here's the thing about contempt. Contempt kind of feels good. It kind of feels good, especially when you know you're in the right. And you're like, man, I'm right. I'm actually correct and you're actually wrong. I've been harmed, I've been victimized, I've been hurt. And so it can be easy to let that turn into contempt. In our story this morning, the Tulsa Massacre, what has come to be known as the Tulsa Race Massacre, you can look it up. A great act of injustice was done. And so it could be very easy for people in that community to then build contempt. Now, what's interesting is there seems to be contempt on both sides happening here. Really, it seems to be spurred on by contempt, actually. A racial contempt. But it could be very easily for the people in that community, in turn, to then say, man, I'm going to build in my heart contempt towards you. And in fact, they would be justified in doing so. And so this is the thing with contempt. This is the hard thing about contempt, and really you could almost interchange it with revenge. Is Jesus seems to say, if you get to the place in your heart where you're building contempt, this is a danger zone. And so Jesus' way people, we have to push back against contempt. When it's so easy in our relationships, in our society, in our communities, in our culture, to lean into this space, Jesus says, no, we need to push back. We need to be people who fight back when you're in a conversation and people are saying, man, don't you hate that person? And you're the only one who says, hey, let's slow down. Let's actually slow down here. I'm not going to have contempt. When someone in your family has genuinely harmed you, and the temptation is to go no contact, the temptation is to write them off, to say that person's dead to me. Jesus says, let's push back against contempt. You can still have boundaries. You can still have boundaries. Love has boundaries. We can still say, these are the parameters under which we interact. But I'm not going to write you off. I'm not going to say you're worthless, you're dead to me. So, Jesus' way people push back against contempt. I want to read another verse. It says, if you are offering your gift at an altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. Okay, I'm going to blaze through this because I'm running low on time and I want you to get this. So, we notice some few things. First, we notice that this man is at the altar, which is probably the altar of burnt offerings in the temple in Jerusalem. People probably knew what Jesus was talking about here. He's talking about religious services in their community. They're directly connected to religious services, and yet he says, leave it. He says, if there's something that you and your brother have between the two of you, if you have not been reconciled, leave the religious service, leave church, and go and make it right with that person. Which seems to suggest to me that to Jesus, reconciliation is more important than religious performance. Which is very difficult for us because we tend to prioritize it the opposite. And Jesus seems to be saying we need to reorder our spiritual priorities here. Often we prioritize the altar over relationships, and we de-emphasize reconciliation. And we're like, well, that's just political, or that's just family, that's private. But Jesus is saying, no, actually in the hierarchy of spiritual priority, relational reconciliation is a higher priority than even being at the altar, than being at the religious service. And so, number two, it seems like Jesus is saying that Jesus' way people prioritize relational wholeness over religious piety. These are people who prioritize, man, I'm not going to be in church if I have something against someone, if there's some sort of relational tension. I'm going to go and make it right with that person. That's my church. Now, again, I'm not saying let's forsake the gathering. Absolutely not. This is where we hold each other accountable. We exhort one another. We encourage one another. We worship together. But Jesus seems to be saying it's a matter of priority. Okay, let's move on. This final part, which is so intriguing to me, he says, remember that your brother has something against you. If you remember that your brother has something against you, this is actually crazy. This is a very difficult invitation, I think, because it does not say if your brother has something against you and they're correct. It does not say if your brother has something against you and they're in the wrong or you're in the wrong. It doesn't really delineate. It doesn't give us an option to say, maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. No, it just says if there's an issue, maybe they're wrong, maybe it's a misunderstanding, maybe you are in the right, but it still says you be proactive. You go to your brother and make it right. And I think Jesus continues it when he says, come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge. He says, you go to your accuser. This is actually, I don't have enough time to talk about all this, but the word accuser in Greek, this is the same word used to describe the devil. Jesus says when your accuser has something against you, not when you have something against your accuser. When someone has an issue against you, he says, you go to them. You initiate. You be proactive. You take the action and say, hey, is there something's weird. Can we fix things? I know that maybe I did something. I don't know. It says you take the initiative. You have the conversation. You make the phone call. And so finally, I think Jesus says, he's calling us, and he says, Jesus' way people are proactive about reconciliation in a reactive world. We live in such a reactive world that's so quick to react, we're so quick to write each other off, so quick to cancel each other. We're more polarized than we've ever been. And Jesus says, Jesus' way people are proactive about reconciliation. If you have a political disagreement with someone, I have friends who do not speak to each other anymore. I have two of my best friends do not speak to one another at all, and they have not for about 6 years because of a political disagreement. This is the space we're living in. But Jesus says, Jesus' way people are different. When the entire world is doing that, we're called the opposite way. We're called to build the bridge. All right. I want to end with this quote by Brené Brown. She says this. I'm going to read this to you. She says, anger is a catalyst. Holding on to it will make us exhausted and sick. Internalizing anger will take away our joy and spirit. Externalizing anger will make us less effective in our attempts to create change and forge connection. It's an emotion that we need to transform into something life-giving: courage, love, change, compassion, justice. Sometimes anger can mask a far more difficult emotion like grief, regret, or shame, and we need to use it to dig into what we're really feeling. And this is the part that really struck me. She says, either way, anger is a powerful catalyst, but a life-sucking companion. So here's the invitation as I close. Jesus' teachings are so rich. So I went a little long today, and I did last week too. Thank you for bearing with me. But I think it's really important because this is really hard for us. But I love that Brené Brown quote. I love that invitation she gives us because she says anger can actually be a catalyst for us to change, a catalyst for something positive, a catalyst for justice, for compassion. So perhaps you've experienced anger in your life, or perhaps you have it towards a person. Perhaps it's justified. It seems like the Jesus way is to ponder, to consider. Hey, I can still have boundaries with someone. I can still have a specific parameter under which I interact with someone, but I can still forgive them. I can still have reconciliation. I can still be a bridge builder. Let us be bridge builders instead of bridge breakers. Amen.